So welcome everyone to this webinar, Expanding the Off-Grid Market Opportunities for Growth. My name is Evelyn. I work with GOGLA, where I lead on member relations and on our event coordination. But for today, I'll be very happy to be facilitating this webinar. I'll take some time to introduce and frame the webinar, also in light of the upcoming investor conference, Unlocking Solar Capital Africa. And as you can see today, we have 3 speakers contributing. I will introduce them in a bit, and after their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session where we will open the floor for your questions, and everything will take more or less 1 hour. So the webinar is organized in the run-up to the Unlocking Solar Capital Africa conference, which will be held for the 3rd time this year in Kigali in Rwanda. It will be, as usual, I can say by now, a 2-day event packed with high-level conversations, with discussions and matchmaking, and a networking area with an exhibition, as well as an insights booth where we will provide our investor audience with the latest market and research data and insights on the solar market in Africa. So like the previous 2 editions, this gathering is organized jointly between GOGLA and Solarplaza. And we're happy to share with you that the Dutch Development Bank FMO has joined this and also future editions as an organizing partner. I'm assuming that you're all quite familiar with us. Solarplaza is an excellent convener and functions as a knowledge platform in the solar energy space. And GOGLA is the industry association for the global off-grid solar energy industry. So any further information can be found online. Before we start, I have some practical logistical notes. Any technical issues that you experience can be reported in the chat box that is directly on the right, and we can see if we can help out there. Any questions that you have for our presenters that come up during their presentations, you should write in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We will list your questions and save them for our Q&A session afterwards. And there we will strive to have them all answered. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please include their name so that it's clear to us as well. And yes, the slides will be made available afterwards. Then on the topic of the webinar, so the off-grid solar sector currently is bringing improved electricity access to over 72 million people worldwide. And businesses are using, so off-grid solar businesses are using diverse business models to reach these customers. Who are often unbanked and are not able to access national grid services. So one of the key challenges in setting up and expanding an off-grid solar business is the lack of comprehensive market data. So where, you want to know where are the potential customers, what does the enabling environment look like, what are the current sources of energy that customers use, etc., etc. Now, at Unlocking Solar Capital Africa, so GOGLA and Solarplaza and our partners from the off-grid, the mini-grid and the on-grid solar sector. So we are working to help overcome this challenge by setting up a very solid conference program, and also by, for example, sharing insights for an array of research that has been done in the past year through our dedicated insights booth. Then in this webinar, we will hear about an exciting new research developed by IFC, together with Vivid Economics, that can help companies access data to assess the potential of 14 different Sub-Saharan African countries. And then, so that's Daniel Shepard and Edward Day. Then we will learn about the practical experience of one of GOGLA's members, upOwa, on how they have used data to set up operations in Cameroon and what kind of information would help them further on their growth path. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the presentation to Dan Shepard, who leads IFC's energy and water advisory services in the Sub-Saharan African region, and is giving a presentation on their Market Attractiveness Index together with Dave from Vivid Economics. Dan, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Good. Evelyn, thanks so much. Let me just make sure that I have control of the presentation now. Great, excellent. So thank you so much. And as Evelyn just mentioned, I'll be doing this presentation together with Ed Day from Vivid Economics. What I'll do is cover a bit about the upfront piece in terms of why we did this, what's really the main objective with this PAYG Attractiveness Index, and then where we're going in terms of next steps. So, and Ed will really cover much of the detail of the index itself. So as a bit of background that I'm sure most on the call know, sorry, I think I'm trying to get these slides there to stay still. So a bit about why we're here and what's the purpose of this index. So as we all know, the energy access agenda and challenge remains critical in the Sub-Saharan African region in particular, which is where I focus my work, where we have more than 600 million people that are still without access to energy. In response to that, IFC, along with other development partners, including the World Bank and others, are looking to provide support across different programs and projects and initiatives as a means to try to close that energy access gap in the region. And this includes various approaches in terms of off-grid energy solutions, where there are a variety that are out there. As many of you know, pay-as-you-go is one business model that really has starting to prove commercial success and an ability to scale up. It holds tremendous promise in terms of helping to close that energy access gap. What we've seen, however, with PAYG companies, many of them, there's a confluence or there's a aggregation of PAYG companies around East Africa. Many of them have started there and continue to grow there. But there's numerous countries in the Sub-Saharan African region. So you think of across the region, there's close to 50 different countries, and the PAYG companies aren't necessarily reaching many of those. And so one of the key things is what can be done to help companies reach and expand into other markets. And so as a part of that is looking at ways that from within IFC, looking at ways in which we can help companies expand into these other markets as a means to close that energy access gap. All that said, this is not to say that pay-as-you-go is the only solution, it's the only approach. There's a litany, or there's at least a variety of different business models and approaches that can be undertaken for closing the energy access gap, including off-grid solutions through pay-as-you-go, through mini-grids, through other approaches, over-the-counter sales, a variety of things, and including, of course, grid extension. So don't want to imply that this is the silver bullet in terms of approach, nor even silver bullet in terms of what the PAYG companies would need to expand. So with that in mind, we set out, and this really, the genesis of this stems from support that we provided to a handful of pay-as-you-go companies, and in discussions with them of understanding some of the challenges that they see. Some that are operating in existing markets know that market, know the country context quite well, but are really challenged by entering new places, new markets, to understand what are the options, what are the variables, what are the pros and cons even of entry in those other markets. And so the genesis of this pay-as-you-go index started from those conversations of understanding that there's a dearth of information out there to help companies make that decision. And perhaps there's a way to consolidate or put into a user-friendly approach to have access to that type of information. So the intent here is to provide information to companies, to investors, to even policymakers, and I'll talk about that in a minute, related to the attractiveness of pay-as-you-go as a business model across different countries. We purposely set out to look at just a dozen or a dozen plus countries, rather than all of them, as a means to understand whether or not this approach would resonate with users, whether or not it makes sense, whether or not there'll be uptake in terms of usage of it. But we were purposeful about selecting this group of 14, and it's a mix. It's a diverse mix intended to be some more of the challenging markets, as well as some of the markets where there is existing pay-as-you-go activity. So the Kenyan and Tanzania, which many ask about, I think is purposeful in terms of calibrating this approach and being able to make comparisons between a country which has a lot of activity versus new countries which have less. It's intended to be very user-friendly, and this is certainly feedback that we hope to get from this interface, allowing the users to readily understand sort of key variables and aspects, and allowing them to adjust those weights. And Ed will go into a lot more detail on that. As I mentioned, in terms of the policy maker's perspective, one of the key things is using this also as a tool to understand where there are gaps and where there's opportunities. Similar to the Doing Business, which the World Bank Group puts out that helps rank countries, this can also be used as a means to do a bit of a diagnostic in terms of what are areas that need further support from policymakers' perspective or from development partners' perspective. One needs to be careful, and I'll throw this caveat out there, and I imagine Ed will repeat this as well, that it's not necessarily a prescriptive tool that sort of puts it on a silver platter in terms of what country to move into and next. There's a need to interpret the results. There's a need to reflect on it based on the core competency or strengths of a particular pay-as-you-go company, and where best that company would be suited to enter in terms of new markets. So it's not, one needs to interpret the results carefully here. As I hand this over to Ed, which Evelyn, please hand the controls over to Ed. As I do this, I think I do want to make a point of indicating this was done in partnership with the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, PPIF, and it also benefited tremendously from input from a variety of investors, pay-as-you-go companies, and other development partners in the process of developing this index. So let me stop there and pass this over to Ed, please.
Thank you, Dan. And I guess I'll start by reiterating a couple of those last 2 points. The way the tool functions, and I'll start by explaining the structure of how we sort of went about conceptualizing what this tool should look like, and then explain how it works. And I guess by its nature, it can't really be prescriptive, in that we're aggregating data across over 70 indicators, which involves, I guess, a complex series of both identifying that data, but then working out how to structure it meaningfully and then weight it and aggregate it into a final index score. And that, I would certainly not, I would be very reluctant to interpret that for a particular country in a particular setting as defining a market as attractive or not. What it is intended to do is provide a consistent and initial evidence base at country level that can supplement other sources or help guide where there are differences across countries. What are the things you'd want to be looking at in terms of both what makes a market attractive or where there may be challenges that would have to be overcome. I should say, before I dive into this first slide, I should extend thanks also to the team at Pegasus and SNV, and also Karen Sosis and Sylvia Emily, who joined the Vivid team for this work. So Vivid led the consortium, but we did have, it was a very collaborative effort with those guys, particularly as part of our team. So if I just briefly, I'll spend a bit of time on this first slide, which sets out the structure of the index, hopefully relatively familiar in terms of economic fundamentals. We initially had quite a range of consultations with various companies, policymakers and other stakeholders in terms of how they think about the pay-as-you-go market at the moment. And that helps us define what we think a relatively comprehensive set of pillars, sub-pillars and indicators are to define a full scope of market attractiveness and a full range of variables that you want to take into consideration. And that's resulted in what you see on the slide at the moment. So without spending too long on this, because I won't go into all 70 indicators in detail, we've separated it into a demand pillar, a supply pillar, and I guess that broader landscape enabling environment pillar. I think we had a bit of back and forth splitting out what's an enabling environment, but sort of briefly what goes under enabling environment is all the things that aren't directly in the supply chain or driving demand for off-grid energy, purchased under the sort of consumer credit model which pay-as-you-go enables. So it includes, trade and commerce, broader legal and regulatory environment. And I guess in particular under enabling environment, we'll come to this later, it includes quite a lot of indicators on information and communication technology, and specifically on mobile connectivity and mobile networks, which have been really important for market development to date, at least at scale for pay-as-you-go products, leveraging mobile money networks and mobile network operators. I think an important note in terms of what this index does is it looks specifically at the pay-as-you-go model. So when we're talking about demand and supply and enabling environments, we are looking at both the potential for an off-grid solar product, but specifically one that would be purchased under consumer credit. So just to give a couple of examples of each of those, on the demand side, what determines market size is indicators around population size. We have a couple of indicators on density, which are aggregated to national level, but it intend to capture both the sort of average density of population across the country, but also help identify countries where there are particular clusters of high density population, which might be relatively easier to access for a sales and distributions network. So that's really focusing on the potential for a small scale off-grid solar product. Under willingness to pay, there's quite a bit more around end user rural populations familiarity with credit products or use of consumer use of things like mobile payment mechanisms, which help us define whether there would be an existing accessible market for people purchasing using microfinance institutions or other types of credit product, which a pay-as-you-go model could leverage. On the supply side, we have 4 sub-pillars. There is, I guess, another access to finance question in there, which sets out a few indicators around ability to access equity for early operations for startup businesses. And we spent a bit of time trying to collate information on ease of accessing finance for international business operations. So, the ability to work across currency and be able to finance what is an initial capital outlay that is then only recovered over time under a credit model through customer receipts in a different currency. On the operational side, this is really all about, while in much of Sub-Saharan Africa there would be enough solar yield, that varies from one country to another in terms of its reliability across the year. So there may be some seasonality concerns, which again wouldn't define a market as not attractive, but might affect how you'd enter that market and how you'd structure both your product and your business model. And the potential for partnerships with key operators in the region comes under operational considerations. One that I am keen to raise now, because it will come back in a couple of slides, is market penetration on the supply side, is a pillar which kind of captures the degree of product penetration to date. And I guess that helps us think about whether a market is attractive in the sense that a high presence of pay-as-you-go companies or off-grid solar products is certainly suggestive that a market, at least a country market, has been attractive. I know Dan and I and others went back and forth on this one because it's a bit chicken or egg. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the place you'd want to focus in the future. So that if that is one of the areas that you wouldn't want to interpret this as prescriptive, but does provide an information base in terms of what's happened, at least historically, in terms of market developments. I'm going to skip on because I don't think we can cover all of this in complete detail. This slide will be a lot easier and be more digestible when we are in a position to share a version of the tool, which I know Dan will speak to later. But when you do get that tool, which is currently in Excel format, what you'll see is there are a series of output sheets which give user flexibility to both select. So essentially what you're looking at, anything in yellow with orange is something that the user can edit and modify or make a selection on. So you can pick on an overview tab whether you want to look at the overall score or whether you want to look at a particular pillar, demand, supply, or enabling environment. And this very much speaks to the idea that we want this tool to be used not as a definitive prescriptive tool where we say, for example, if you look at the overall scores, Kenya is the most attractive company and Zambia is the second most attractive company for that's not particularly the idea. We have spent a bit of time thinking about the weight you want to attach to each of the three main pillars: demand, supply, and enabling environment, and each of the sub-pillars within those. So there is some built into the tool when you get your hands on this. It will warn you if those don't add up to 100%, which they do need to, but it does mean you can change those. And I think if you were, for example, a policymaker who was thinking, well, I'm convinced there is a demand in this market, but what I really want to know is what are the legal and regulatory conditions, that would allow you to weight that higher or place all of your weight on that and see how that would affect the scores across the countries and the rankings. In terms of how to interpret the scores, they are all on a scale of 1 to 100. So at each pillar, the top scoring country is by default set to 100, and the countries underneath that are on a relative scale to that top scoring country. So they don't, I don't think those scores are interpretable in terms of their absolute number, but they do provide a relative ranking. Very briefly, for those who are interested in the detail, there is a indicator tab in one of the output tabs. Is an indicator tab where you can select every single one of the indicators, and you'll see both the raw data score, which does have a clear interpretation, I guess, and the relative weighted scores for each of those indicators. So the one we've got up there is cumulative sales by country based on Gogla data. You would be able to see, for example, that Kenya kind of dominates this indicator, and the cumulative sales of off-grid solar products over the last 4 years or so are much higher there than anywhere else. You also see what that turns into in terms of a normalized score for that indicator. Okay, I'm going to spend, I guess, the next 5 minutes, hopefully I'll try and keep it short, introducing some of the results and how you might interpret those before handing back to Dan for next steps. I'll go pillar by pillar and just introduce what the index shows under the default weights that we've assigned, and a few words of caution in terms of how you'd interpret these. So on the demand side, Kenya is the I guess, largest or most attractive market in that across market size, ability and willingness to pay, it scores very well. The ones you see just underneath this, I'll touch on briefly. Places like Nigeria have a very large market and relatively high income, so good ability to pay. It scores slightly less well on willingness to pay, and that's largely driven by a relatively limited use of mobile money and credit products in Nigeria at the moment. Nigeria is also up there in that it has one of the more unreliable national grids, which defines both, I guess, the market size and willingness to pay for alternatives. I did want to touch really briefly on Malawi because I think it's an interesting one that we've had a bit of exchange on. It comes up as one of the potentially more attractive countries on the demand side pillar because it is large, it is relatively densely populated, it has low access to grid electricity, all of which sort of looks good from an off-grid solar or pay-as-you-go perspective. Where you'd have a challenge on Malawi, and you'd want to interpret this with caution, is it is also one of the, it ranks near the bottom in terms of ability to pay. So that being only one indicator doesn't pull Malawi further down, but I guess that would be a real challenge in terms of accessing a country market like Malawi, where consumers have very low incomes and might struggle to meet the sort of cost of a pay-as-you-go product. To introduce the supply side, and this does come back to the word of caution I mentioned earlier in terms of market penetration, Kenya is far ahead in terms of the relative rankings of other countries, and this is largely because it has such high market penetration of off-grid and pay-as-you-go products at the moment. In terms of, there's a pack of countries that are quite close together underneath, just behind Kenya, and they're for quite different reasons. So Zambia, for example, at least on our index, scores has really good access to finance for project developers and relatively good infrastructure to access rural populations. Both Zambia and Tanzania have really good access to reliable solar yield across the year. Senegal, I think, is slightly different, and we'll come onto this on the enabling environment, in that it on the supply side has it tops the scores in terms of access to human capital, so education levels and specific training for sort of off-grid related training programs is what puts Senegal up among that pack. So on the third pillar, on enabling environments, what we see is, for once, Kenya, a nice example where Kenya isn't top of our index. If you were to look back at the slide I showed earlier with our default weights, you might notice that under enabling environments, we place quite a high weight on the ICT, information and communication technology. This is largely due to the importance of mobile payment mechanisms, and that's where Cote d'Ivoire scores particularly well in terms of proportion of the population with access to mobile phones, connectivity services across the country, existing use of mobile money and mobile wallets. Cote d'Ivoire really does lead the pack by quite some way, and that puts it at the top here on enabling environments. Senegal again was another interesting example where, and this is largely from the RISE indicators, which are aggregated into our index. It scores really well in terms of the regulatory conditions for financial support packages for both solar home systems and specific solar components, and relatively attractive tax and import duty regimes for solar products. I think I'll pass really quickly over the slide you're looking at now, but essentially this lets you look at, and there's another one that does the same across all the sub-pillars, but doesn't fit very nicely on a slide. This shows the relative scores for each country across the overall score and the three pillars, aggregated into, I guess, a least attractive set of countries, a middle set of countries, and a most attractive set of countries in dark green. This hopefully is relatively intuitive. Actually, it was reassuring, at least for me, that this kind of made sense, that you've got Kenya as the only country which lands in that top bucket of most attractive countries across all three pillars. I guess interestingly, Angola was the only country that is in the least attractive bucket across all three. And then you've got places like Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a relatively big market and could be attractive on the demand side, but would certainly have challenges to overcome in terms of operating a supply network and the broader doing business and policy and regulatory conditions. So I guess this gives you the snapshot of where you'd want to look in terms of overcoming challenges in each of the countries in the index. But again, it shouldn't be interpreted as saying that a particular country is therefore not attractive, but lets you hoover into or focus in on some details of where you'd have to overcome some barriers. We have a slide here on Nigeria, which I think I might pass over. You'll get the deck. As a really brief overview, we had a bit of a focus study on Nigeria, which is in the final report which will accompany this tool, as a particularly interesting market, which has some really good scores across the index, and then some slightly lower scores, which was interesting and surprising in some cases. It's also a country market which has followed a slightly different development path to some of the other countries in our index. And without going into the details of this slide in total, I guess one of the key takeouts is a relatively poor access or poor usage of mobile phones in Nigeria, and in particular of mobile money. But I guess what you do see there is an alternative business model that's developed, including partnership of, for example, the Lumos and MTN partnership of a PAYG company with the mobile network operator that then uses a different payment mechanism through use of airtime, for example, to get around if you are in countries which don't have extensive use of mobile money. So I won't go into lots of detail on that Nigeria case, but I do think it's one of the fascinating country markets that the tool, a combination of what's in the tool and other research sources, let you get a really good in-detail view of a particular country market. So I think on that note, I should probably hand control back over to Dan, because I know he's keen to talk about what happens next with this tool and where we go from here. So Dan, back over to you.
Great, thanks Ed, very much. Let me just see if I take back. Okay, great. So just maybe I'll hit a couple of points that Ed just mentioned, but I think one of them is just on Nigeria, and not necessarily the country itself, but rather why we wanted to include the snapshot is, as I mentioned in the beginning, is one of the uses of this index is for policymakers and development partners. And so I think having that diagnostic capability of this index could be a useful means to try to influence policy. Thinking again, the analogy being the doing business indicators, and how that can help encourage or push countries to create a more conducive environment for off-grid energy is something that we certainly hope or at least aspire to in terms of the use of the index. So really quickly on next steps, because I'm mindful of time, we are finalizing this tool. It is, as mentioned, an Excel-based tool at the moment. We're certainly happy to share it. So you'll see my contact information in the deck that'll be circulated. And so those that are interested, I'm happy to share the Excel tool as well as a user guide. And then, as Ed just mentioned, we also have a final report that accompanies this that we will make available at a later date. But at least the user guide and the Excel tool for those that are interested. We are hoping, we are in discussions about the possibility of launching this as well as part of the event in Kigali that Evelyn mentioned at the beginning. But what we also want to do is we're cognizant of the fact that this is only 14 countries, and there's many more countries, not only in the Sub-Saharan African region, but there's many more countries in terms of emerging markets that this could address. And so in terms of also what we want to do as a next step is to expand the number of countries, probably double it or something to that effect, trying to reach a broader number of countries. I think one of the things that we really learned in this process is, and many of you probably on the phone already know this, is getting data and accurate data, appropriate data is not an easy feat in many of these countries. And so I think that was one of the key learnings that we walked into already knowing that this is going to be a challenge, but I think it really became clear in terms of what data is available or what proxies can be used when data is not available. And so I think one of the key things is taking that and then trying to take those experiences and expand to other countries and be realistic in terms of what data can be incorporated and how. We also do want to make this a much more interactive tool rather than Excel-based. It's Excel-based for the moment, but hopefully we'll put this into an online version in the coming weeks or months that'll be even more user-friendly and available to all. So I will stop there and turn it over to Evelyn.
All right, many thanks both to Dan and Ed for sharing this contribution. I'm pretty sure that many of the participants listening in are very excited and curious to get their hands on the index. So you'll probably get a lot of emails afterwards. Just as a reminder to the audience, please keep asking your questions via the question box at the right-hand side on the GoToWebinar control panel. We will be collecting those questions and we will be posing them to our panelists at the end of the webinar. And then I would like to invite Caroline Frontigny, who is co-founder and Chief Business Development Officer at upOwa, to share a bit more on her practical experiences from running a PAYG enterprise and the use of data to understand market drivers in Cameroon and setting up operations there. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Hi Evelyn, thanks for the floor, and hi everyone. So my name is Caroline Frontigny. I'm the co-founder and Chief Business Development Officer at upOwa. And for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to walk you through a concrete example on how we use sets of data for key upOwa's operation. So to start, just a quick overview on upOwa. So we are a PAYG distribution company. We started operation in Cameroon in 2015. Today we are 3,000 clients, so 3,000 kits installed in Cameroon. We install solar kits for light and phone charging. So for those of us not super familiar, it's basically small solar panels, small battery and lamps that allows houses or small shops to have lights. We do have our proprietary pay-as-you-go software. So at the beginning of upOwa, we were 3 engineers. One actually a former World Bank data analyst, which was me. I worked for 4 years at the Doing Business reports and on the RISE indicator. So I was quite familiar with available data sets, especially cross-country, and how to use it. So we do try, and we're still trying to brew this culture of data-oriented decision in the business. So first concrete example was actually for us on how to choose a country, because what was particular with upOwa is actually when we thought about starting this business, we had no country in mind. We were in Washington, D.C., and we actually looked at the map and say, okay, where should we go? Our only constraint was that we were French, so we wanted to be a Francophone country. Looking at the data that was just presented by IFC, this would have been like super useful at the time. As we had not as much data, we actually primarily looked at 3 sets of data that was available across country in Africa, which was all from the World Bank database. So population without access to electricity, per capita income, and the ease of doing business. We wanted to have, kind of a big base, a base of potential clients that was as big as possible, with some money because we wanted to, sell our solution. And we looked at the ease of doing business because we wanted to be a private company with foreign workers. So that was also a big set of data that we looked at. So it was back in 2013. There were actually 3 countries that popped that were kind of the top of the list, which was Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Cameroon. And from there, we actually looked if we could find some support from local governments in one of this country, and we did find some good support in Cameroon, where we were welcomed by a mayor association that allowed us to run a pilot, which was after this pilot that we did decide to stay in Cameroon to launch operation. So here the takeaway was that we used some data set, but that was like very limited data set that was available at the time, and we relied, but that gave us some idea on where to go, but we did rely on some local experiment to finally decide where we would settle. The same apply for how to choose the HQ city, which was also some of the key decision we had to make when we started operation. So we looked at 4 sets of data. The first one was the proximity of rural population. We also looked at cost of operation in several cities, especially how it would cost to rent the office, what was the average salary in different cities. We looked at the efficiency of the local utility by visiting some local utility center and asked how many connections they were making around. Spoiler alert, not a lot. So we're like, okay, that's also a good way, a good place to start. We looked again at the income of local population, and for this we used the national census. But some of the issue that we found with this type of national census is that it was quite old. It was from 2005. So again, you have to make some assumptions on where the data is, on how realistic is the data for the present, and that's kind of a challenge. On this, something that are like not data related, but that was very important in this decision was the support from the local government and having access to electricity, phone, and internet in the city where we would install our headquarters. In the end, we decided to install our operation in Bafoussam, which is at the bottom of the arrow. And just, for the story, we finally moved to, after 3 years of operation, we moved to Yaoundé for 3 main reasons. First was to attract local mid-level managers for logistic reason, and also the proximity to partners, namely mobile money operator, logistic operator. So also something to think of when we think about like important things for developing a PAYG operation. Also, another decision for which we used some data was to set our commercial offer. Basically, for a PAYG company, when you want to decide what you're going to offer to your clients, you want to think of 3 things. First, what are the kits and accessory you would like to provide to your target population? Namely, do you want provide how many lamps? Do you want to provide a torch, a radio, a TV? You have to decide on the price the total price of your product, and also on the credit plan that you will propose. So how much will be the down payment, what you will request daily or monthly from your customers. So for that, we did use some national data, again from census, but that was quite old, some from 2005, that details some spending on population, on rural population, on lighting and leisure activity. As our kit was also seen from our first pilot, we realized that it was seen as a luxury product by our clients. So that gave us some idea on what this kind of affordability line. But on top of this national study, we did some survey in-house, especially to find more information on phone charging, how it was done, how much it would cost for our target population. Again, here the datasets was useful to kind of set some limits, I mean, to have an idea on what would be a reasonable commercial offer. But again, it was with doing an actual pilot on the ground that we really could validate how relevant our commercial offer was and how we could tweak it one way or another. And I guess this is the case for all of all companies. I mean, people will tell you that they will pay this and that, but there is always some surprise when you come back and you actually request for the money. You will have other response from the customer that you interviewed previously. Finally, how to choose villages. And here again, we are at this level at the moment where we are expanding operation in new regions in Cameroon. So we have this challenge of how to choose where to expand your operations. And on this, it's super hard for us to find relevant, comparable data across regions. So we do rely on in-house surveys. So basically, we hire students to go in some specific areas to locate villages and to ask questions on like the 6 points that I mentioned on the slide. So the population, is it grid of grid? What is the road access? The mobile coverage and the mobile bony coverage, which could be quite different. On this, we do have some challenge, even when we are on the ground. The first one is that it's super difficult to, super difficult. It's challenging to actually locate villages. You know more or less where they are, but there is no maps that will tell you exactly where they are. It's not on Google Maps. It's sometimes on maps that you find on the road. But we do have some crazy story where some students told us that they actually had to to go through a river and to pay for canoe to get to villages where we asked them to go, which we had no idea, because that was nowhere, the villages was not at all where it was supposed to be, even in the region indicated by the national census data. So here again, relying a lot on in-house with some challenges on geographical data especially. So just as a quick summary of my presentation, so there is challenge with data for operation in rural Cameroon. First one is to find, to have relevant, comparable, accurate data, especially on a sub-regional level. A lot of difficulty with the geographical data. So we have to rely a lot on in-house data collection, which has a cost for the company, and also introduce a bias, as we are not professional data collectors. So, I mean, we also know that we have to be careful in how we use this data. That also means that we have to build this capacity in-house of collecting and analyzing the data. As a conclusion, so optimizing operation is key for PAYG developments. We see that across all companies in the sector, and data is for sure essential to understand and optimize operation. But relevant data again is hard to find, and so as a company, we rely a lot on in-house data and on trial and error process. So we are very keen on seeing data sets, like strong data sets being developed, and we look forward to see it developed on a sub-regional level, which is what we would need at the moment to continue developing operations. So, well, thank you for your attention. Please don't hesitate if you have any question. On a side note, we are fundraising to expand our operation in Cameroon. So if you're interested in that, also please feel free to contact me. I'll pass on the mic to Evelyn and look forward to your questions. Thank you again.
All right, thanks, Caroline. That really sounds like quite a journey that you went through to get from the start to where upOwa is now, and really shows how how crucial data is for for PAYG companies, and I guess for all companies. So we have quite some questions coming in, so I won't waste time and I'll dive straight into our Q&A. I'll see if I can kind of like filter out first a few questions for IFC and Pivot Economics. I think one of the questions that is asked a few times is, will the index be accompanied with supporting documents and data as to kind of like show how this index came together and how the scores have been derived? Dan or Ed?
I'm happy to answer that, and jump in. Yeah, there you go, Dan.
Sorry, I was fumbling to get to the mute, to unmute. Yeah, so in response to that, yeah, absolutely. So we've mentioned, Ed mentioned as well as I did, there's an accompanying report that have more details in terms of the methodology utilized to develop the index that we will circulate in the coming weeks when it's ready. There's also a user guide that I mentioned that's specific in how to use the index. I think it's not static, and so there, I think it certainly comes when looking at it in a presentation, it comes across a bit static, but that index can change based on variables, and so it is it is important that the user be able to interpret the results as well. And I think there is guidance in the report in terms of how to use this and how to interpret some of the results and output. But it does, again, as we're going through the presentation, there will be certain results that you'll see, and one needs to then step back and understand, okay, what are the implications for my particular company or my potential interest in this segment? And it may not necessarily be a binary thing of yes, no, don't go into the certain market, but rather it could be, if I go into this market, then I'll have to adjust my business model slightly to adhere to the local circumstances. So there's a lot of interpretation, and I think what the report is intending to do is help with that, but it's not it's not going to be able to cover everything.
All right, excellent. Another question that just came in is, what do you think the index can offer to mobile network operators that want to expand their PAYG partnerships and activities specifically? Is there any relevant data from the mobile industry which would further support the index? Yeah, so and Ed, feel free. I'm going to be very quick, and if you want to chime in as well. Without a doubt, from the perspective of an MNOs, this tool can be used to help assess where it might want to venture in terms of going to the PAYG space. What we've seen with a variety of MNOs, they're recognizing that pay-as-you-go can be an important segment in terms of new customer acquisition, and so looking at where it already, from an MNO standpoint, already has a presence, what it might want to then think about is expanding into that PAYG segment if it appears to be an attractive area in the country. And it can also then, what are some of the conditions or factors that need to be incorporated if an MNO is to partner with another entity in the PAYG space? What does it need to be mindful of in terms of that business model? And so I think there's opportunities. There's, as Ed mentioned, there's one of the categories is specific to partnerships and recognizing that pay-as-you-go really
can benefit from working across the value chain, and I mean working with different entities across the value chain, MNOs being one of those. I don't know, Ed, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, just briefly, I think sort of what we've presented on the slides is a very broad overview, and it sort of doesn't get under the skin of any of the pillars. But when you get the tool, what you can then do is dig into the demand, supply, and enabling conditions, and so you can quite easily then identify markets which have really favourable mobile network operator sort of conditions, but don't have a high presence of PAYG companies, or vice versa. You know, identify those markets where they're not quite as developed as they could be in terms of mobile network. And you know, I think that does help people at different parts of the value chain identify what they know they could improve on by digging into the specific sub-pillars of the index. So I think that's absolutely the kind of objective, is to by setting out a framework, allow you to go in and identify the areas where a country is already relatively attractive, and you think, well, you know, by partnership or by bringing experience from elsewhere, we could unlock that one critical barrier, be it mobile network, or be it that we have a really good mobile network system, but not the PAYG presence. I think that's absolutely the kind of point of how the tool should be used.
All right, excellent. Thanks. Okay, so I have one more question for you guys before I move to Caroline. Can you share anything on you know, if you already have any sight on this, on how often this index will be updated to include, for example, you know, different market conditions that are changing, maybe new countries, like for example Uganda, or also will it include more commercial data in the near future for example, private capital mobilization?
So thanks. I think that question is the same type of questions we've been asking ourselves over the last several weeks as well, in terms of what's needed in terms of update, what's needed in terms of expansion. I think in terms of some of those sort of sub questions there, I think when it comes to expanding to other countries, as mentioned, that is certainly something that we expect to do over the coming, I'd say, 6 to 8 weeks, and to include another 10 or 12 countries. In terms of incorporating additional commercial data, I think that also depends a bit in terms of feedback that we're getting on the use of the index, and what perhaps areas of adjustment that could be incorporated. So I think hearing from users as they use this, of if there's missing pieces, as I mentioned very briefly in some of my comments, we went through our consultation process with this, and really reached out to investors, PAYG companies, development partners, to arrive at this, and incorporated their feedback, and really thanks to Ed in particular. But as we move this forward, it is still open to a process of improvement, and so if there are areas that can be added or incorporated, we're certainly quite keen to hear that. But we don't have anything in specific plan in mind in terms of how frequent updates the data, except to say that obviously it needs to be updated frequently enough so that it's useful. I mean, anything like this is only as useful as much as it gets updated. So very cognizant of the need to have that done.
All right, excellent, thanks. And so don't forget, you can always, Edward, and so Dan's contact details are in the webinar deck that will be shared afterwards. So feel free to reach out to him with any questions and I guess suggestions. Caroline, I have a few questions for you as well. So could you speak a little bit more about upOwa's partnership with the mobile network operators? What are some of the lessons learned about this partnership that you could share with some of the other PAYG ventures?
So for us, mobile money operator was a key partners, because we really wanted to have all of our payments on mobile money in order to be lean on operation, especially in money collection. So we worked with Orange at the beginning to integrate our software with their mobile money software. And I think one of the key lessons learned was that it takes a lot of time. It took for us like almost a year to get this partnership up and running. And that was definitely not, you know, a time frame that we had in mind when we started, you know, working with the mobile money operators. And it was actually the same experience when we had to work with other mobile money operators in the country. Second thing also is that it's mobile money operator can also be good partners when you go and reach out to rural villages. But it depends a lot on, I mean, for our experience, for my experience, for our experience at upOwa, it depends a lot on, you know, who is the regional leader of mobile money operator in the region and how, you know, keen they are on doing a partnership with you. So here also, like, not a straightforward partnership, but when you make it work, it's definitely worth it, as we do have the same target population. And for us in Cameroon, most of our customers do not have mobile money, so they have to sign on the mobile money operator before we do the installation. So that was kind of a win-win partnership when we made it work locally. Well, hope that helps.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a few quite specific questions. So, so for example, for the in-house study, how big of a set were you able to gather to build enough confidence in your conclusions around ability or willingness to pay to define your pricing model?
Well, that was really at the beginning of upOwa. So we run, so on the willingness to pay, several things. So on the census data, I mean, it was a census data, so that was quite big of a set. But for us, we did run a pilot on, I think it was 200 kits. Before we did change our commercial offer, saying, okay, like we have this feedback and we need to, you know, to adjust the model. Namely, we did change the time. I mean, our biggest change after you know, a couple of months of pilot was to change the time to reimburse basically the credit plan time. And it was over a 6 months observation. So there.
Okay, I think that's quite clear. And another question: when doing that survey or like researching or looking at data, did you also look at indebtedness or over-indebtedness levels of your potential target groups? And if yes, how did you do it? Did you use credit bureau information or did you use data from the microfinance sector?
No, what we did was to just ask a question in the questionnaire that we run to all of our clients, but basically asking like, do they have any credits running apart from the one that we would offer them? And we only rely, even at the moment, we only rely on our clients, you know, willingness to tell us if they do have, you know, some credits elsewhere. It was not, I mean, we never had this type of information from microcredit organization, as they are quite reluctant to share this type of data with other partners, especially from the private sector at the moment. But hopefully we could collaborate more on this point in the future.
All right. Thanks, Caroline.
Sure.
That kind of brings it at the end of our Q&A. There's only, I think, a few more questions left, but we are, I think, perfectly on time. So with that, I would like to end the webinar. I'd just like to say that Caroline will be at Unlocking Solar Capital. So we're still discussing with IFC how we can integrate the index into the event as well. I hope Dan will be there. I hope to see all of you there. The recordings and the slides will be sent automatically to your email. And with that, thank you very much for your time and your attention. And my panelists, Caroline, Dan, and Edward, thank you so much for contributing to this webinar.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks for organizing.
Pleasure. Thanks, Eveline.